All right, it's time for the news update with contributing writer Jake Fogleman. This week, Jake, you have a pretty interesting story about gun ownership in the United States and some new data that we have that gives us some insight into how many new gun owners there have been over the last 2 years, since the pandemic started, and some of the breakdowns compared to previous years. So what's going on with that?
Sure. Yeah. So, much of what we've been covering in the news and seeing in other outlets is talking about just how many new gun owners there possibly were when we saw this massive record-breaking spike in gun ownership. We had some surveys suggesting upwards of 8.5 million people. But those were retail surveys, so we didn't really have a great idea. So there's a new research paper out from a Northeastern University public health professor using National Firearms Survey from the 2021 National Firearms Survey, and an additional survey that he conducted covering not just during the pandemic, but also the year before to see how rates may have changed. And they found from the 28-month period from January 2019 to April 2021, 7.5 million people is what they're estimating became first-time gun owners. So not quite as much as some of the retail surveys suggested, but still a pretty substantial amount of people became first-time gun owners. Yeah,
it's certainly lower than what the National Shooting Sports Foundation dealer survey has estimated, but there's a couple reasons for that we'll get to in a minute, perhaps some of the differences here. But the important point, I think, from this survey is it's another piece of information that shows there really was an uptick in new gun ownership over the course of the pandemic, especially the early pandemic here.
That's right.
And that's significant, I think. Obviously plays a lot into our politics nationwide, into some of the themes that we've talked about since the founding of the Reload. And honestly, I was talking about it before that at places like the Free Beacon and Washington Examiner. But this influx of new gun owners will likely have a significant impact on gun politics throughout the country in the course of the next several decades. I don't know that it's necessarily seen some sort of massive immediate impact, because that's not usually how people operate. They don't always, you oftentimes don't see them go immediately from buying their first gun to becoming a single issue voter on gun rights. But certainly over time, you would likely to see more and more people from this pool of new gun owners move that way. And that's why this is also significant. But back to the survey for a moment. What did they find in terms of a difference in new gun owners between 2019 and during the pandemic? Was there an increase in the proportion, like the number of people becoming new gun owners, or was it just that there were so many more guns sold overall that the proportion stayed the same, but you got a lot more total gun owners?
The researchers found more to that latter point. They said from 2019 to 2020, they thought the proportion was relatively constant at around 20% of purchasers were first-time buyers. But just the fact that there was a sheer increase in volume in 2020, it was, by all metrics, a record-breaking year for firearm sales, that just the absolute amount of sales contributed to an additional influx of new gun owners.
Interesting. That's interesting. So they're sort of, I guess, going with the idea of a high tide lifts all boats sort of situation, where you just had so many more guns sold overall that the proportion of people who were new gun owners didn't change, but still resulted in a record number of new gun owners, really. And so you reached out to an expert to talk a little bit more about this survey, or get his insight as well, as a Wake Forest University professor, David Umani, who we've had on the podcast before, actually.
That's right.
But what was his take on this paper? What did he see any critiques that, off the bat as to how the numbers came out here?
Sure. He thought the survey was conducted well overall. He had nice things to say about the methodology, but his general overall point was, this is something he said and other researchers have said in the past, is that just surveys in general tend to underestimate gun ownership. And so in this case could possibly be underestimating first-time gun ownership. one of the big reasons that he gave, I have a quote from him here. He says, one major reason is systemic non-response, which we've covered before, is when, if you're a gun owner and you get asked, hey, did you buy a gun or do you own a gun? Some gun owners may, quite frankly, just not want to respond to that kind of question. They don't feel comfortable sharing that information. But he thought that, he pointed out that this survey found a personal gun ownership rate of 31%, which is, that's fairly constant with other polls that we've seen. And it's higher than
you've seen
some,
that with Gallup.
Sure.
I think Gallup and Pew have come in somewhere in the 1/3 of the population area as far as people who personally say they own firearms. You get a much higher rate if you go with people who say they live in a home with a firearm. That's you get up into the mid 40s with that, usually in the percentages. But yeah, this does seem to come in close to what a lot of other survey-based estimates have said in the past. So yeah.
Another interesting thing that I did want to point out, we've heard a lot of trends about the increasing diversity in gun ownership, particularly amongst new gun owners. A lot of retail surveys mentioned that they thought, almost half of my customers now seem to be women, minority gun owners. And this was actually confirmed in this study. And they actually said that they thought it predated just the COVID pandemic. They said in 2019, they were already starting to see this increase in diversity. I have some of the numbers here. Just in that 28-month period studied, 48% of new gun owners were female, 21% were Black, 19% Hispanic. And another trend, the second largest age group of new gun owners were under 30, so those 18 to 29. So a big increase in young gun owners who are traditionally less represented in gun ownership in previous surveys.
Yeah, and this again backs up what really the industry has been saying for years about the demographic change in gun ownership in the United States. I think, and we've talked about this before as well.
Sure.
2020, early 2021 isn't changing the paradigm, but it's accelerating that movement towards a more diverse population of gun owners in the United States. And this survey really backs up that theory. And it backs up. It was kind of a win for NSSF, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, because this matches fairly close to their dealer surveys.
Sure.
Not exactly, right? The numbers aren't perfectly aligned, but they both show the same broad strokes, and it matches up with the studies they've been doing for nearly a decade now when it comes to demographic changes within gun ownership in America. So, just more evidence to what's been out there. I think it's coming from a different source, which is always a valuable thing to try and get a better idea of what's going on. If you have multiple different sources with different motivations and different incentives coming to the same conclusion, that usually gives you a better, there's a better chance that means the conclusion has some validity to it. So, the interesting survey, good piece on your part, by the way. I think that's it for this week.